Hello, my name is Matthew Sortino and welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. In today's episode, I am speaking to Rachel Goldberg. Rachel was born in Fergana, Uzbekistan, which was then part of the USSR in 1943, to Polish Jewish parents Eva and Nathan Rynderman. To frame some of the history that is spoken about during this podcast, I want to begin with a key part of the war that is often left out of history class. Many forget that the USSR or Soviet Union started as an enemy of the Allies. In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed between Nazi Germany and the USSR, which publicly declared a 10-year non-aggression treaty between the regimes, but secretly planned to divide Poland with their eventual invasions of the country. With the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939, Eva and Nathan fled Nazi-occupied Western Poland and went to Bialystok, which was in Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland. The two were subsequently captured as Polish, not Jewish prisoners, and sent to separate work camps in Uzbekistan. Believe it or not, Hitler was not a man of his word, and he invaded the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. With the Nazis now an enemy of the Soviets, the USSR quickly changed sides to be a member of the Allied powers. This meant peace with Poland and the release of Polish prisoners in their territory, including Eva and Nathan. Eva believed that Nathan would still be alive and that he would be trying to join General Anders' army, the Polish armed forces formed in the Soviet Union, which had a meeting point in Tashkent. Eva found her way onto a troop train to Tashkent, and whether by luck or determination, Eva and Nathan were reunited at Tashkent station and survived the rest of the war working in factories around Fergana, Uzbekistan, the birthplace of Rachel. After Allied victory in Europe in May 1945, the family made their way to Poland, then France, before coming to Australia in 1948. Although it is an incredible opportunity to have these conversations, with both my guest and I often feeling quite positive afterwards, it must be recognised that these stories are profoundly tragic. Rachel's mother, Eva, lost her entire family, while Rachel's father, Nathan, lost everyone except his sister, Lena. This was the reality for many European Jews. Not only were 2/3 of European Jewry killed, only 1/3 of survivors had another member of their family survive. Today's story, which in many ways is one of triumph, is actually a tragedy of the highest order. I cannot imagine what it would feel like to celebrate the end of the worst war of all time, only to realise you are the only surviving member of your family due to a genocide. The fact that so many survivors were able to not only move on but thrive is a testament to the strength of the Jewish people. Rachel captures the duality of this reality, and I am so thankful for her openness and vulnerability when sharing her story. In part 1 of today's podcast, Rachel shares the story of her parents and her early life growing up the child of survivors. In part 2, Rachel discusses her life, career, family, and contribution. This episode is the first of a 3-part mini-series where I speak to Caitlin Feynman, Rachel's daughter, and Nathan Feynman, Rachel's grandson. To weave together a tapestry of a family story with 3 generations was such a privilege, and I am so lucky to be able to bring these episodes to you. Before I get to the episode, I would like to ask you to please do a few things for me. Firstly, follow the podcast so you can be alerted to when a new episode comes out. Secondly, please give this podcast a review wherever you are currently listening to it. A 5-star written review goes a long way towards getting the podcast out there. Thirdly, tell your friends, family, and your social media networks about the podcast. I do not have social media, so I am relying on you to be my messengers. Finally, please do get in touch if you have any ideas, potential guests, feedback, or even opportunities to work together on the podcast. Thanks again for joining me, and without any further delay, I bring you Rachel Goldberg. Rachel, welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. I'd like you to start off with your early life. Where were you born? Who were your parents? And, what was early life like for you?
I was born in 1943 in Fergana in Uzbekistan. My parents were there because of the war. My father and mother, Nathan and Eva Rynderman, got married just at the time that the Germans invaded Poland. He had been an infantryman in the Polish army, and when Poland fell, his captain told him it was going to be bad for Jews to get out of Poland. So he went to my mum, who he was going out with at the time, and said he was going to go to Russia. And her father asked her to come with him, and her father said, go. She wanted her father to come, and he refused, saying that he would be an impediment. And so I don't know how they left Warsaw and made their way to Bialystok, because by then the Germans had already invaded, and they had already divided the country with the Russians. Bialystok had become Russian territory, and they made their way there, and they got married there. Mum made another attempt to get her father to come, so she went back to Poland with the ketubah and then asked him to come again, and again he refused. And she made her way back to Bialystok. They then tried to cross the river, and they got caught on the other side and were taken as Polish prisoners of war.
At what point, Rachel, did you learn this story? Was this something that you grew up with at an early age, or did this knowledge come to you much later?
I think it's something I've always known. I don't know where or when. I don't remember being told it. It was just part of family history. It was part of the story that could be told. I said to Kate as we were coming here, I always thought my parents talked a lot, but as an adult and looking back on it, they spoke very little. I thought my father talked a lot, but he didn't give you any history, and there were no family stories from either side told. My father was one of 6, and one sister survived, and my mother was one of 5, and she's the only one who survived. My father would always tell the names of his siblings, but my mother never did, and it took a long time for me to be able to remember their names, and there are no stories about them. So it's one of the shames.
And that remained for your whole life, that those stories never came out later?
The stories that did eventuate were always tragic, and there was one from each side. My mother's brother was killed very early in the war when the Germans asked the young men to come out because they were going to go to work, and they were all shot. And my father's sister, one of his sisters, was married and had a child, and she gave the child to some people that we know nothing about, and we don't know what happened to the child. And that was all we knew.
I want to find out much more about the story of your parents and the way that they made their way eventually to Australia. But before I do that, I'd love to get to know a little bit about you and your life growing up, in your early years. And you mentioned that you thought that your parents spoke a lot, or your dad spoke a lot, but then realised later on that he didn't. Was that just because when he did speak it was so important that it remained with you, or was it speaking about things that weren't related to their history?
He had a sister, Lena, and her husband, who also left Poland, and they went to Russia, although they weren't together. Yes, she was a communist before the war, so that he was quite free in Russia. And Dad always spoke about her, and he had enormous love for her. Dad was the youngest. There was 15 years between him and his oldest brother, and they had always left home for about 15 years before. When Dad was about 15, they had already left. And they were living mainly in Paris, married with children in Paris. And one year I looked in the Jewish Museum in Paris. There was new names, and their names were in it. You always look up names. Wherever you go, you always look for names. So Dad talked about his living sister, and Mum didn't talk at all, except that she loved her father and her mum wasn't so important in her life. When Dad talked, he was always very emotional and very full of love about talking about Lena. And they both made the little that they said an adventure. And I also think that I was scared. I didn't want to ask too much. And I remember I was already well and truly married, and I had kids, and a friend had been to Poland, and she was at my place, and I don't think Mum was, Dad was, and he asked about Poland with such intensity and desire to know about it and the names of streets, and that I realised how shocking it was for him to have been deprived of so much and never allowing himself to go back, because the pain and the anger would have been too much, I think.
Mm. So as a young girl growing up, you said you were born in what is now Uzbekistan and in the Soviet Union at the time. Do you have memories of that place? So
No.
where were your first memories, would you say?
I don't have strong memories. I probably have a memory of going by train to Paris and leaning out of the window, because that's quite strong. And I have a couple of memories of the ship coming to Australia. And playing with dolls and washing dolls in sea water and buckets. But that's about all.
So just to get your early life then, 1943 you were born, and the war ends up finishing in 1945.
Yeah.
And then at that point, was it, we're going to go back to Poland now? Was that the initial thinking?
Yes. And again, I only have reconstructed it because my parents never talked on dates. Mm. They were taken as let me go back. They were taken as Polish prisoners of war in 1939. And they were separated and were in different jails. In 1941, the Russians joined the Allies and made a treaty with the Polish government in exile in England to let the Polish citizens free in Russia. I think that's important that they were Polish prisoners of war because they didn't let the Jews out.
Okay.
There. So Mum and Dad were then set free. In reconstructing it, I don't know where Dad was, but I think Mum was in Siberia, and she thought that Dad would join General Anders's army. Now, General Anders had been a general also as a Polish prisoner, and he went, I think, somewhere around Tashkent to form a Polish brigade that was going to be under British command. And Mum thought that that's where Dad would go because she thought that he would join the army. And I don't know how long it took her or who she met on the way, but she hid in a troops train. And I think she met up with another woman, but I'd never hear the story of the other woman on the train. But she hid on a troops train where the captain of the troops train found her, and she persuaded him to keep her on the train. He locked her in his cabin so she'd be safe, and let her off at Tashkent. She went to the Red Cross, and Dad had written on the wall that he was there. She wrote on it. This is just serendipitous. He came back with the 2 days, saw it was there, wrote another message. She saw that, and they met at the train station.
And which train station was that?
In Tashkent.
In Tashkent.
Yeah.
So did they both know that that's where they would be, or did they just happen to end up there?
It was just
wow.
luck. It was
That's
just
amazing.
luck. Because they hadn't heard from each other. And Mum said that she assumed Dad was alive because she hadn't heard that he was dead. I mean, she was obviously a very positive woman.
An optimist.
Yeah.
And it turned out.
And it turned out,
yeah.
yeah. And then from there they They were together, and then they worked in Tashkent, and they heard that there was work in Fergana, and then they made their way there.
That was right nearby.
Well, it's in the mountains.
Okay.
It's in the mountains, and it's a valley in the mountains, in the Fergana Valley.
Okay.
The stands had a lot of Jews there. I think they say there was between 250 to 300,000 there, and there wasn't much anti-Semitism. Okay. They had the fate, and they suffered the fate of the Russian people there.
That's interesting that they were seen as Poles first and then Polish prisoners of war rather than, I guess, Jewish prisoners of war.
I think they were lucky.
Yeah, how did that end up happening? Was it because they...
I never asked the question. I don't know. But they were taken as Polish prisoners of war.
Potentially the military being involved in the army there was the reason.
Well, they were taken by the patrol on the border.
Okay.
So, it's they were very fortunate.
So they were up in the mountains in Uzbekistan, and they ended up finding their way back to Poland.
Yes, I assume in 46.
Okay.
45, 46. By that stage, the Russians had already come into Poland, or my aunt and uncle were already there, and they were part of the political bureau. So we lived in Łódź.
Political bureau, that was your aunt and uncle on your father's side. Is that Lena? Was that
Lena?
Lena? They were
Yeshi,
Okay. Because I do know that often Jews returning home to Poland weren't welcomed. Was that the case for them?
I don't know how much they publicised they were Jews. Right? My mother assumed her mother-in-law's maiden name, which was Okonowska, which was a Polish name, and my name changed to Inka. So obviously they weren't known as Jews. Rynderman wasn't a particularly Jewish name, and my relatives were brown, so they weren't known as Jews. And my uncle rose within the bureaucracy. So by 1954, he was in East Germany as the head of Lot.
Your parents had left before that, though?
Yes, Mum didn't want to stay in Poland, and Dad had a cousin in Australia, and Maury sponsored us. And we came here in 1948, having been in Paris for 6 months waiting for the visa.
Okay. And did you leave from Paris, or did you leave from...
We left from Marseille.
Marseille. Yeah. I've heard now a couple of stories of one of the main ports being Genoa in Italy, and Marseille was another major...
Yeah, yes. But there also was a displaced persons camp in Italy.
Okay.
So they may have gone from there as well.
At this point, you are how old by the time you reach Australia?
I think I'm close to 4.
Okay. What are your early memories of Australia and growing up, not only about Australia itself, but also life with your parents in Australia?
I think in Australia, it was, for the first 10, 12 years, it was very difficult. I remember when we came, we were at I don't remember, I'm told, that we were at my uncle's place, Dad's cousin, for a week, and then we left. And then we stayed with people that we were on the ship with, and that was in Newmarket. And I remember that as quite pleasurable. And then after that, we might have been there 3 to 6 months. It was near the railway, the sidings, and I always remember the smell of Newmarket because of the abattoirs there, the cattle yards and the abattoirs. Then we went to Paran. My parents were factory workers, and Dad had tried to have a shop in Kyneton which went bust. So he was paying that off and working in factories. So we were relying on my mother's wage. So I think it was hard. I think that I was sort of all ears and listening, whereas I don't think my brother did that. And then we moved around a bit. And then I think we ended up in Caulfield, and we bought a house, or put a deposit on a house. And I went to Caulfield North and then to Macrob, and it was quite stable. It was okay, you know. By the 5th grade, when I went to Caulfield North, there was a lot more stability. And then I think in the 3rd form, I must have been about 15, we got a milk bar. And that stabilised the family completely. So I think it was a sort of a migrant experience at that stage.
So I guess the freedom of running their own business at the milk bar, was that nearby to where you were living?
Yes, I stayed at the same school and
Yeah.
Yeah.
A migrant story, economic maybe difficulties as part of that. At this point, had you or the family kept a Jewish identity within the household that was strong, or was this still something that hadn't developed much
No,
yet?
we had a very strong Jewish identity, but it was based on Holocaust. We weren't religious. Neither of my parents were religious. My father had a religious background. They both came from traditional families in Poland, but both families were in business in Poland with non-Jewish people, so that there was some assimilation. After the war, my father, I asked him once if he believed in God, and he said, it's not a heavy burden to carry. So he avoided it altogether.
Yeah.
We didn't celebrate, because they were working all the time, Friday nights, we never had a Shabbos at home. And we used to we didn't celebrate the festivals, and we used to go to my uncle for Pesach. But in the meanwhile, my father always used to sing in Yiddish, and he always used to sing liturgy. So it was something that he loved, but he didn't was ambivalent about, I assume.
Was that something that he would have learnt in Poland? Or
Yes. Yeah.
And your uncle that was here, was that Lena and her?
No. Lena.
Oh, this was
the one who sponsored us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maury, was it?
Maury, yeah. Yeah, that was fine. Lena, they left Poland in 1954. We tried to get them here, but Australia wouldn't let any communists in. And they went to Venezuela. They were lucky. You asked whether they were Jewish, whether they were known as Jewish or not. There was an occasion when their son was playing with the friends and there was trouble close by. But it was my mother. It wasn't Lena who went out to get him, because it would have been known that he was a Jewish child if Lena or Yeshi went to get him, because they were known. So it was my mother who went into that situation to bring him out. It was quite hidden. And when they were in East Germany, my parents and his brother sent papers across to West Germany. We thought he could pick them up. We thought he had a love for communism that was so strong. But what they had done was that when he went to East Germany, one of the children had to stay in Poland in a boarding school, and they took the 2 youngest ones with them, so they couldn't abscond. Okay. So it was really quite interesting.
It is one of those things where East Germany was seen as, maybe a communist paradise to begin with, or a hopeful utopia, but then the fact that they had to make assurances that they weren't going to leave by sort of kidnapping almost, or, ensuring that other family were known, their whereabouts were known, shows just how early it was where the East Germans knew that people wanted to leave. And
the Polish did too.
Yeah.
The Russians and Polish did, yeah.
And so was that, they went to Venezuela in 54, you said?
54, 55.
Yeah, so was that a legal way to get across, or did they?
No, that was legal.
Okay.
It was legal. What happened was they had a relative in America, in New York, who ran factories in Venezuela, and they couldn't go to America either. So he got them a visa to Venezuela, where they stayed for 2 generations.
Oh, wow. I know this story is about you, Rachel, but it's also this family tapestry and learning about what happened. The Holocaust, obviously, as we know, killed two-thirds of European Jewry, but out of that and those that survived, there is this story that's beyond a migrant story. There was that for everyone after World War II, but you couldn't just move on and not talk about who you were, or that was always a part of it still, even after this horror, wasn't it?
Yeah, the third generation of the family, part of it have come here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've returned, they're allowed. So your family's got the milk bar,
Yeah.
and you're living in a much more stable environment in Caulfield North. At this point, you mentioned you're not very religious, but you were Jewish and that the Holocaust was a key part of that. What did that look like? How did that come out?
It wasn't by memorials. Mum and Dad would go to shul every Yiska. Every festival that had a Yiska, they were at shul.
And many non-Jews are listening to this. So what is a Yiska?
A Yiska is the commemoration prayer for the dead. And really it's a prayer to God. The people aren't mentioned at all. That was holy to them. It was only when it wasn't my children that went to Jewish schools, because they went to Jewish schools in year 10. It was my brother who sent their kids to Bialystok and who celebrated Friday nights with Shabbos with singing, that my father came out and just loved it. My husband's family, Alan's family, were Australian Jews, and they never missed a Shabbos, which was really interesting. And their identification as Jews, they were fifth generation here, and their identification as Jews was extremely strong. And there was no Holocaust. There was straight religion. Although they weren't religious,
it was those rituals and traditions.
but the rituals and traditions were so important, especially to my father-in-law. My mother-in-law pleased him by doing it, but it was my father-in-law who wanted it. And by that stage, when I took it over for that family, and then we combined, it was a lovely, lovely sort of family affair. And it was at that sort of stage that Judaism for me became a family affair and a joyous affair. My husband's family had absolutely no paranoia. Interestingly, my brother also married Australian Jew. They were probably Sephardic originally, but they were also 5 generations Australian, and their Judaism was religious. It wasn't Holocaust. And it was a very different experience.
I noticed that you smile when you talk about that, Rachel.
Yeah.
Was there you talked about paranoia and even maybe a burden that was associated?
It was a great sadness. Yes, it was sad. There wasn't a lot of laughter in our house. It was. I think that the laughter came after the milk bar. My mum was very sick. She got very bad asthma, and then they got a delicatessen, so it was 5.5 days' work instead of 7. And by that stage I'd married, and after a few years had children. And I think it was the becoming grandparents that brought joy to my parents. The hard times were over. They were in their late 50s. And my father had a pleasant time when they sold the delicatessen, and he got a job in clothing shops, and he liked being dressed, and he had a very pleasant time. And then there was a lot of joy. I think Dad had about 10 years, and then he got bowel cancer. But yeah, that was when there was pleasure in the family.
It seems to be a recurring theme where it takes up until grandchildren arrive that something can lift, and maybe that joy and happiness and a letting go of some sort can begin.
Yeah, it's. I think your turn will come with it. When you become a grandparent, it's like a continuation of life is assured. A continuation of your life is assured, and there's enormous pleasure. And grandchildren bring you enormous pleasure. Yeah.
I've got 2 little ones of my own, and I see that, especially with my dad. But yes, beyond that, actually, you're reminding me of my uncle who moved when he was 13 from Italy. So Sicilian family. He was quite a happy kid, although my dad's father, his father, was earning money in Australia, so we didn't really know him. He visited twice. Yeah. A baby was born each time, and he went off and earned money again until he had enough to bring them to Australia. But he was quite sort of miserable. He said he didn't speak in protest for the first year of arriving in Australia. And I think he held on, I know this is your story, not mine, but he held on to that too. And I think it wasn't until my kids were born that I've seen him for the first time, because they say, I love you, and hug him. Yeah. There was none of that. He was very caring, and he showed it in other ways, but there was never that touch or that intimacy. But now it has arrived with my kids who force it. It's
lovely, isn't it? It's lovely. My father was very affectionate.
Okay.
He was a very affectionate man. It was my mum who also was affectionate, but she was the one who sort of held the family together. Mm. She was a strong one. She was the one who looked at consequences, and so she had a tougher time. Mm.
Yeah. Do you have a couple of examples or anything you'd like to share about, your early life or growing up before we move on, that can help us experience it or understand it a little bit more? Is there anything that comes to mind about that, without going too sad of a way forward, but, something that you remember or that sticks with you?
I think that John and I were sort of Jewish youth movement kids. Okay. And that's where we spent, sort of weekends and stuff.
How did that come about, Jewish youth movement? Because you said there wasn't that...
Well, we were strongly identified.
Okay.
I went to SCIF for about a year and a half, I don't know, not for long, from about 10 to 12. And then I went to Habonim, because I had friends who were going to Habonim from school, so I went to Habonim. And also, I think I was about 14, 15. I had a friend, I must have been already at Macrob, when I met someone and she was going to the temple. So I took myself off to the temple and went to didn't go to Sunday school, I went to their Wednesday school, which was sort of comparative religions. And I got really a very good grounding and a love for the religion from the temple. And I stayed there. My parents were sort of traditional, but I kept going to the temple until I married. And it was Alan, whose family was very involved in Turak, and I got married at Turak Shul, that I became a member of Turak. But I always had and always have a very strong feeling for the reform, because that's where I got my understanding and appreciation of Judaism.
What are the differences? So I know that the Reform Temple is that in Caulfield?
No, it's in Elmer Road. It's all over the place. Yep. It's nationwide.
Yeah, but this specific
one was in Elmer Road.
Okay.
And they were very welcoming. Yeah, I felt very much at home there.
Yeah.
And they've got a different interpretation. Their prayer books are more modern. It's just a beautiful use of language.
Yeah, and Rachel, going back a little bit to some of those differences that you noticed between the European side of your family and the Australian side of the family, what were some of the things that you did notice there?
I think what happened was that with my relatives here, they couldn't understand us. But also, we came 48, I married in 67, right? My family were the first Europeans that my parents-in-law were friendly with. I mean, so you're looking at strangeness or differences that people had to get used to. We stopped speaking Polish at home and only spoke English because Australians didn't, Mum said, if we were on a tram or a bus, for me not to speak so loudly because I was speaking in Polish. People didn't like it. In those days, the word was assimilate, not integrate. And that's what we did.
Talking about the differences between Australian and European Jews, even non-Jews, I guess,
Even
because it was
non-Jews, that's
an
right.
Australian and European, and there was a huge amount of
split.
Europeans coming to Australia from
And a
everywhere.
huge split in the Australian Jewish community and the post-war migration of Jews.
So was there, in that knowledge then, was there also a connection with other Europeans from you at school? Was there a sense that you were Australian or European when you were growing up? What was that identity like?
It was quite mixed. I realised I wasn't European when the first time in the 70s when Alan and I went overseas, and although my values might have been more European, it's hard to talk about that because I can't tell you exactly in what way. I no longer fitted in. And it also, that was already over 30 years. And I was a baby when I left Europe. So I was never European. But that was when I realised I was Australian.
It's very interesting that it sometimes takes you stepping out of Australia or whatever it might be to realise what you are or who you identify
That's right.
as.
Yes.
Yeah. Very, very briefly, I had the same thing when I moved for university to Albury, Wodonga.
All right.
And I went to Catholic school, Italian kids everywhere and all of that. But I never felt overly Italian. I thought I'm an Aussie guy, Aussie kid growing up until I went to the country and I was looking for Italian food and couldn't find anything. And then I was just listening to people and people would start throwing the word like wog around and, and I was like, hang on, what's going on here? And someone had never tried lasagna before and all this stuff. And I was thinking, I've realised I'm Italian. Like I've got an Italian background here. I identify with my Italian culture much more than I thought. And from that point, I started to connect with it much more because I was almost trying to reject it because I didn't want to there was a way of promoting your identity at my school that was very nationalistic and anti sort of Australian in a way to try to build up that nationality, which I rejected, but then realising that you don't have to be like that to embrace your culture. That's either.
Right. Yes, and nowadays it's not assimilation, it's integration.
Yeah, melting pot rather than you all should be the same. So you talked about Jewish youth movement and also arriving in 48 and then married in 67.
Yeah.
And there's such key dates actually in relation to Israel as well.
Yes.
Did you grow up with that connection to and thoughts of Israel? Was that something that was part of your upbringing?
We weren't a strongly Zionistic family, but Israel was always part of our existence. I'd gone to SCIF because my parents' friends as kids had gone to SCIF. But I think my father disliked it. Maybe dislike was a bit too strong. But I think that he didn't like what he considered might be a remnant of the anti-Zionist philosophy, because the Bund before the war was anti-Zionist. Well, there was a Zionist movement developing very strongly, and they were part of a socialist international community. And I think that they made that dichotomy too strong. But after the war, they weren't anti-Zionist, although I believe there are still some people who are not pro-Zionists, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
They're not quite neutral. And so that I think he was happier when I went to Habonim and John went to Habonim. In the early days of being in Australia, we used to go to the Warsaw commemorations, and in the early days they were in the town hall in the city, and they were awful events. I mean, people were hysterically screaming and crying, and it was just awful. Nowadays it's pretty refined, but then it was very raw. And SCIF, it was also the camps. It was very, very raw. So I can't tell you that I was traumatised because I don't know from the stories of my mother or father told me, but I certainly was traumatised by the stories that I got from Skiff. And then later on Habonim, because they were, again, very, very pro-Jewish. Whichever their direction was, they were very pro. But I learnt an awful lot. So I think my identification came from there and from the temple. But later with Alan, and particularly now, it's probably religious. It's a combination of all of that. And it's a very lovely change. Mm. It's not a change based on anxiety and persecution. Having said that, times have changed again here, but I've still got that.
Would you call it like a reclaiming of that? Because
reclaiming of the religion?
Well, if not the religion, the way that you at least identify with Judaism. It's not because of a fault of anyone, but there was that rawness, as you said, whether it was at the Warsaw commemorations or whether it was at home, where being Jewish was linked very closely, especially in Melbourne and other communities with a lot of survivors, was one of that paranoia or that move on, or
one of terrible tragedy and sadness.
Yes.
Well, I can't talk about other kids. My brother didn't have it.
Was he born in Australia?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he was born 9 months after we came here, but it's totally different. Mm. But it is a suspiciousness where I'd have to check everything out to see where the land lied.
And was that something taught explicitly, or was it something you saw and it was subconscious?
I think it's what I developed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's what I developed.
Yeah. It seems like as you were able to, get older and have your own kids and then grandkids later on, that reclaiming, I guess, it wasn't about that tragedy as much anymore.
No,
that was a part of it, but it wasn't what it was.
It's not what it is, no.
Before I move on to, your life as an adult, is there anything else you'd like to share about your parents, or any stories about whether it was before you were born or something that you remember that they might have told you, or something that you remember of them growing up?
I think both of them said that before the war in Poland, they had very good lives. They were sort of cafe society people. And they had, Mum enjoyed being dressed, and she used to tell me that her one sister was a milliner and another sister was a dressmaker. And she enjoyed her memories of Poland before the war. And she enjoyed talking about that sort of pleasure. Yeah.
And that's a key part of Yad Vashem teachers and other education, is about really highlighting before the Holocaust that there was a vibrant community.
Yeah, very vibrant. And Dad didn't talk about his community before the war, except for his love for his mother and his sister, although he was a very handsome man. And he was a cafe society guy. He didn't talk about it, but he was. And had a very lovely, warm manner. But it was in that way that Mum let you know that there was another life that she had, that it wasn't the sort of the hardness of migration, the hardness of the war and the hardness of migration, because it was hard.
And that's interesting, because it's not just, I guess, there's the element of surviving and maybe some sort of happiness that comes from that, or some relief, but then also there is that pain and suffering of what occurred during the war and during the Holocaust itself, but also of what was lost, and that's probably the biggest part.
Yes, huge loss.
Of life, obviously, and family, yes, but also of the way of life and that history.
Right. And I became very aware of that. Again, the first time I went over to Europe, and I suddenly became aware of what was it like to come without language, no money, and no history. I mean, if they had ever heard of Captain Cook, what would it mean to them? Never heard of him. And to leave the sort of the grandeur of Europe and to come to a fabulous country. I mean, Dad said this was a good country. But to leave that fabulousness of Europe and the culture behind is very difficult. And I think they were very aware that they spoke English. Mum was aware that she couldn't read and she couldn't write. And she went to, when they sold the delicatessen, she went to CAE, adult education, and she was writing essays. It was good.
And just for the sake of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that she had some sense of pride in herself, yeah.
So you said your parents were from sort of religious families in Poland, but were they also educated in and you know, you said that cafe culture, so middle class, educated?
Generally, yeah. No, they weren't educated.
Oh, no, okay.
No, they left school. Neither of them wanted to continue school. So they left at 14.
Okay.
They were very determined that we'd be educated.
Yes, that's what I was sort of leading to. So at what point, I mean, McRobb is part of that. Was that a scholarship?
No, at that time McRobb was a zone school.
Okay.
And you got into it through central schools.
Okay.
And I was at a central school. It was still on merit. It was the top 5% of the school went to these selected schools. So I was one of them.
And what do you think made you care and approach education, you know, to be in that top 5%? Did it come naturally to you, or was it something that was pushed by your family?
I don't remember it being pushed at that stage, no. But it was something that, you know, I'd study a week before the exam or that sort of thing.
Okay.
Whereas I guess other kids didn't study the week. It was a different culture in those days.
Yeah.
My parents weren't insistent that I go to university. In fact, I don't think they even thought about it. What Dad wanted was that I'd have something in my hand and that I wasn't a factory worker. Anything would have done, except Mum didn't want nursing.
Okay.
But it just happened that I went to McRobb, but it just happened that I did my matric and got a scholarship and went on to university. It wasn't burning ambition.
I want to move towards your career and contribution, I guess, going forward. So what did you study at university and what was it like in your sort of that formative adult years for you in building your career in that direction? How did that progress?
It progressed pretty directly. I left school and I went to university. I did social work arts. I can't say to you that that was a burning ambition of mine. I wasn't particularly interested in doing matric. I was going to leave school and go to teachers' college. In fact, it was in the fifth form. But the headmistress was such, Miss Barrett, if you're going to leave school, you had to go and talk to her. And I had done all my exams, my medical things for teachers' college. And so I went down to her and said, I'm leaving school. And my mum had gone every year for open day and spoken to the teachers and said, do you think Rachel can do her matric? And they always had reassured her. And she looked up my marks, and she'd always spoken to Mum. And she said, you're not leaving school. Your mum wants you to do your matric. And if you continue with it, I will not recommend you and you won't get in. So I was didn't care one way or the other. So I continued school. But I hadn't put in an application for university. So when you get a ComSchol, that's a passport to go to anything. And so I put in a late application and I had interviews and got into social work arts.
I know that you ended up continuing in that direction and with psychology. That so? How did that happen? And was there a moment? Or even before that? Do you think that anything about the way that you were brought up, or the conditions, or your parents, was that something that drove you?
I felt that I wasn't secure and I wasn't confident. So although I kept passing and I wasn't a serious scholar, unfortunately. So I would work 4 weeks before the exams. I'd do my essays and then do the exams. And in those days you could get away with it because it was 1 year. you had an exam at the end of the year. It was only one exam. Now it's two semesters. So you actually have to keep up all the time. So I kept passing. Then I went to work as a social worker. And I never wanted to work too hard, so I dropped the arts. And then after I finished, when I had children, I went and finished the arts. Okay. I worked as a social worker for about 2 or 3 years and then had kids. And then I went and worked voluntarily. The kids were at kinder, and Katie was at kinder, at Anglican Marriage Guidance, and they retrained me in what they call transactional analysis. And then I was working in adoptions, and then I went with friends into an art gallery, into a decorative arts gallery, and I was there for about 5-6 years, working with the Anglicans 1 day a week and 3 days with the gallery. And although I liked the gallery, it wasn't my love. And so I decided to go back into social work, but I felt I needed to retrain. So I got into the Bachelor of Counselling and Education, as friends were doing it, and it seemed a good course, in 1984. I was in my 40s then. And I finished that, and I went back to work in adoptions, but this time helping adoptees find their birth parents and in doing the introduction. And then I moved to Relationships Australia and did more marital therapy or relationships therapy. And then I decided to Victorian Association of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy course to be able to move deeper into counselling. So moved into long-term therapy. In the meanwhile, you do a lot of workshops and training along the way. So I did family therapy and different workshops. I didn't rush my VAPP, so I took it over a long period of time. And in that time I had parents die and grandchildren born, and the whole life circle was going on. So I just plodded along with this other thing and became a psychotherapist and then worked for myself.
Yeah, so that life cycle. So with your job, so I always think that, like, why do we get to where we do? And often it just seems like we fall into it, or it's something that we do. But that work with relationships and even adoptions and was it meeting their parents, or was that their prospective parents, or was this their birth parents?
Birth parents. They were already adults.
Okay.
But I had already done adoptions. In my first job in social work, I placed children. Okay. And I hated that job. I interviewed parents, adoptive parents, and took consents. And I did that quite a while. I did it for a year or so before I had kids. And it didn't sit comfortably with me. Yep. Although the times were very different. And so in a way I was doing it the other way around. What was it about my personality that chose the fields I worked in? Yeah. Look, I think that there's always a sense of wanting to belong and that sense of displacement. I mean, I don't feel displaced, but obviously I was displaced. Obviously I had to work hard because I moved schools every year. Till I got to the 5th grade, I moved schools every year. So there was this sense of instability. And there was financial instability as well, because my parents, Mum, when she worked in factories, she worked in Australian factories, and they didn't seem to, she was a finisher, they didn't seem to shut down. Dad was a presser, and he had seasonal work. So in between times he'd go off, he was quite a good, he was a very good salesman, Dad. And he would go off and sell things in the country, or for a while when the factories were closed, he would work in conjunction with a tailor, and he would go out to your lawn and places like that and take fittings for suits, bring back the fittings, the measurements, And the tailor would make them, and then he'd go out again and do the... He was very good with people, but it was hard. It was a tough time for them. And so I think that sort of... it gave me an edge of understanding where people came from, I think. And it gave me a different mentality of working with people.
And you mentioned belonging and that idea that often there was a temporary nature to your early life, at least in where you were and what you and your family were doing. And do you think that working with people that were maybe going to lose a relationship, potentially their stability, or to gain this parent, or that had it been involved in, you know, when there's adoptions involved, no matter how lovely it is, there's always that potential to search for your birth parents, or you wonder what if. So do you think that was driving you?
Look, I don't think it was driving me. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that I was very tightly held when I was a baby and very young, because Mum said children in Uzbekistan, although it was different to the war, the actual war, Mum said children died like flies. So I was very, very tightly looked after. But I think I was I think I was a timid or a nervous child. I think that what my work gave me, and that work does, is it gives an intensity in relationships, especially when you go into psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And I think that was where my forte was, and that was where my interest lay. So you choose the career that suits your personality.
You mentioned during this process you also had children and grandchildren along the way. What did you learn about, or what did you learn from your parents or your upbringing that you brought into the way that you had your household, as a parent and then a grandparent?
I think it's the importance of family. Yeah, my parents, their lives were, I mean, they had friends and they went out and they had a life. But the stratum of their lives was family, and that was what they'd lost. And the stratum of Alan and my lives was family. And I don't think we ever deviated from that. Of course, you have other lives, you have other aspects of your life, and they're very fulfilling. And I was very lucky. Both my kids responded to Alan and I, and we all kept close. We were very fortunate in that they were very generous with their children as well. And their children, since when Alan was sick, and they were very, very loving with him. And I mean, they were young, and they were very, very loving. The guy was 13 and the girls were 19. And they cared and looked after him beautifully. And they've been beautiful to me, since he died. It's a more than essential part of my life.
The name of this podcast is Their Stories Unbroken, because it's about hearing these trauma-filled, stories of loss to begin with, but then out of that there's blossoming of family and new life and new ways of being that may not have ever happened if it wasn't for that, in a way.
Maybe the intensity wouldn't have been there in the same way. Yeah.
Before I let you go, is there anything that we haven't discussed yet that you'd like to add?
I think I've been very fortunate. I've had a very fortunate life. And I sort of hope the fortune continues with my grandchildren and then with the coming generations.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Their Stories Unbroken is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the founders of the Bialystok community, who in 1942, a time of tragedy and horror for the Jewish people, and for so many others around the world, visioned and developed Bialystok College as a new type of schooling for the youngest members of the Jewish community. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, follow, review and share. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. Thank you to Bialystok College and all the staff behind the scenes that have helped make Their Stories Unbroken possible. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the Bialystok College Parents Association for their support in the podcast, as well as to musician Adam Starr. Additional thanks to Yad Vashem and the Gandalf Foundation. Please check out the show notes for links and any additional information. See you next time.